Welcome to the Independent School podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. As an executive coach and strategy advisor, I guide senior leaders in the world of education to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time, helping them go from exhausted to strategic. On this podcast, I share the ideas and tips that I've developed over the years to help the leaders that I've worked with one-to-one, so that I can help you on your priorities and achieve your goals with confidence and with ease. And this week, I am thrilled to be joined by Hayley Mintern, a partner at Anderson Quigley. Hayley is going to be joining us to talk about some of the trends that she's seeing in recruitment into senior roles within schools, both in the UK and internationally. And we are in safe hands. Hayley has been supporting the education sector for the last 10 years, providing executive search and interim and consultancy solutions to the independent school sector, academy trusts, FE colleges and universities. And as you will hear in our interview, the fact that she's got experience across those different areas of the world of education is really important in the work that she does. Her speciality is understanding the education sector and connecting talented people who are passionate about providing high quality and inclusive education. Hayley is really passionate about education, which clearly flows through all of our conversation. She's a governor for a MAT, Multi-Academy Trust, and she works closely with the head and trust leaders there to ensure excellent levels of education. And she's previously worked closely with England rugby schools to deliver inclusive sport in schools. So the topics that Hayley and I talk about cover a range of areas, but we're largely looking at themes around equality, diversity and inclusion, EDI, and how we enhance the track record that we have in the school sector around appointing into leadership positions with a really strong sense of having that equality, diversity and inclusion at the heart of what we're doing. And part of what she thinks is the key to that is looking at how do we look beyond just our obvious competitors when we're seeking out new talent? How do we have a strong employer brand, and particularly using LinkedIn in that is obviously really important. How do we structure the recruitment process to make sure that we're being truly inclusive at all stages? And then towards the end of our conversation, we talk big picture about the changing role of the head, the executive head, the CEO, whatever the job title is, the person who's at the top of that leadership hierarchy. What is it that we're seeing that's needed, that's different now to how it used to be? And what's really interesting for me is the overlap between what Hayley's seeing as being the traits and the experiences and the qualities that are identified at the recruitment stage into those senior leadership positions, and then the ways that I work with senior leaders through executive coaching once they're in post. And there's a real overlap there, the importance of strategic thinking, the importance of a more commercial or business-like acumen in the way that we approach things. And I think that's really interesting to hear about as well. So without any further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Hayley Mintern. Hello, Hayley, and welcome to the Independent School podcast. It is fantastic to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
So, as you will be expecting, I'm going to start by talking about the root of your passion for education, especially when we have people who are not educators. You and I are not standing in a classroom in front of children, but we share this passion for education. Where does yours come from? What is that root for that commitment?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, actually, but I think I was really lucky in terms of the school that I went to. And it wasn't an independent school, but it was a very well-regarded state school. It was a girls-only education. And I just was fortunate, really. You know, I had good teachers. I was able to really learn and thrive in that environment. And I'm still friends with people that I went to school with now. And I think that's probably a testimony to the culture that they had within the school. And then earlier in my career, I was lucky, actually. I started working for the Rugby Football Union, and initially they were quite a small entity. There was only sort of 50 employees across the business. And I ended up working with schools rugby and looking at various different programmes, from national competitions to primary school curriculum delivery programmes to inclusive rugby union programmes through state schools for a programme called All Schools. And I just really got the bug for education there. I was fortunate enough to meet with lots and lots of different individuals that had a real passion. I saw firsthand how sport was able to be used as a tool to bring people into different learning environments and really shaped and changed some people's lives. And actually, I think I was just in awe of a lot of the people I met, and they just inspired me throughout that time that I was working in that role.
Yeah.
And then I moved into recruitment, and initially I was sort of recruiting more broadly in sort of corporate environments, etc. And I just felt that wasn't for me. Like the people I were meeting, they just didn't spark that enthusiasm in me. I want to learn from people I talk to. I want to see that passion that comes through. So that's when I started specialising more broadly in education. And I just think I'm really fortunate and really privileged that every day I get to speak to so many different people that are shaping the future of our country. You know, they're shaping people's lives. And I just really, truly believe that everybody has the right to have the right type of education for them. And I read a quote the other day that, you know, because it was National Teachers' Day yesterday, around we are developing people's futures, and we are really investing in teaching and learning and learning from our history to shape the future generations. And for me, that's really inspiring, and I just love being able to work in this sector.
Yeah, I think what you and I share is sometimes you just know what feels right, don't you? There's some intuition that goes on, and when you're with the right people, and that for us, both of us, that means being in the world of education, it just feels right. It feels like you're getting a buzz, you're learning from people, you're kind of with your group of people, which is fantastic. So one of the things I know you're also really passionate about is equality, diversity and inclusion, so EDI. Where does that spring from? You mentioned inclusivity within the work you were doing with schools work for rugby. Was that where that sparked from?
I think it's more broad than that. You know, I just think there's a real opportunity for schools to embrace that, and maybe that it's just the world that we live in, and technology has advanced so much over the last few years. And, you know, I think that schools have a real opportunity to embrace that and embrace that diversity of thought, and challenge and champion inclusive processes and cultures that enable people to feel that sense of belonging, to feel valued, to have a real collaborative environment. And for me, I just think that's where we're going to get change, and where we're going to be able to learn from in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, one of the most compelling reasons, well, there are two compelling reasons. The first is, just to be honest, it's so much more fun to be in an environment where you've got a whole diversity of different people, because you're learning more, you're getting more stories about the world and more points of view, and that could be cognitive diversity as well as all different other forms of diversity. But then the compelling kind of business case, if you like, is you're going to miss out on a huge amount of talent if you're not out there actively trying to make sure that you are seeking out people who are different, but in the most amazing ways.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There was actually some research done recently, and it said that companies in the top quartile for gender ethnic diversity on their executive teams are more likely to achieve above average profitability than companies in the fourth quartile. Yeah. You know, it's about having something that's fit for purpose. It gives you that competitive edge. It gives you a global perspective, but it also means that you are really challenging each other and challenging your thoughts and challenging how you deliver. And that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often see that when I'm doing strategy workshops where we're talking about bringing in external trends, and the conversation is more lively and more diverse when we've got all different points of view coming from all over the place. And this isn't about one form of diversity, it's all forms of diversity that contribute to a much more wide-ranging conversation at that point. So what sorts of trends have you seen over the time that you've been working in this area, specifically around EDI into leadership positions within schools?
So I think, if I'm honest with you, the independent school sector has been a little bit behind the maintained sector in thinking about some of this and looking at some of the challenges. And you're really starting to see over the last couple of years that people have actually really started to say, look, we want more diversity on our shortlist. We want to see talent in all its forms. You know, we really want to challenge the assumption of what a traditional leader in various roles in independent schools look like. And I think that's hugely important. And for me, I think there's a real opportunity to look at how we can bring in talent from other areas, particularly of education. We can look at higher education, we can look at the maintained sector, and all of those people have a slightly different perspective and a different way of learning or bring new ideas into the fold. And I think that's really important that we start looking at those on some of our shortlists. And interestingly, I read a report quite recently which looked at some of the key competencies of a head teacher and looked at some of the leadership skills that are going to be needed in an AI revolution. And some of the things around that were around business and commercial acumen and being able to develop and deliver a sense of people and leadership throughout their teams. And I think that's just a really different way, certainly in some of the leadership roles in the schools. We haven't seen that over the last decade. And we have to look beyond our competitors. I remember sort of some of the first work I did in the independent sector, and the brief that people would give me would say, right, my competitor up the road is doing X, Y, and Z. Can you go and have a conversation with them and see if they'll come and join us? Which works in a way that obviously you're moving somebody, they can come and replicate an idea. But actually, are you really challenging that? Are you doing something different? Are you looking beyond the sort of traditional models? And the only way, in my opinion, that we can start to do that is if we start to say, we will look beyond the immediate talent pool and look from some of the learns that have happened in higher education, some of the learns that have happened in the maintained sector. And what's happening with the academy trusts is probably very similar to what's happening with a number of independent schools at the moment. People are looking at how to commercialise, how to form the groups. And that's a different skill set to running a very traditional school. So for me, it's about going beyond our traditions, and really challenging ourselves and challenging our own thoughts. And it's about having diversity that goes way beyond gender and race. It's about thought processes, it's about education, so it's around challenging the biases that we all naturally have. We all have them. We have to be able to challenge ourselves.
Absolutely. I think that's a great example that we do see a lot of churn in the sector, especially, I know within the international schools, you see quite a high rate of churn in terms of leadership time at any one school is quite low before people are then moving on. And in the UK, it can be the case as well, especially kind of at deputy level. And there is this sense that it's just a roundabout of people moving from one school to another sometimes, which doesn't really serve anybody particularly. What we're looking for is fresh ideas. Now, that can come from within the sector, doesn't have to come from outside the sector, but absolutely ideas that are kind of coming from HE and from the maintained sector within a UK setting, and then thinking internationally about the opportunities for people to move across borders to share best practice and ideas and fresh thinking. And I think the other thing that comes to mind as you say that is, we're not looking for somebody, when we're looking for a leader, we shouldn't be looking for someone who can replicate the success at their previous school, because actually that can go quite badly wrong sometimes. If you see someone trying to come in and say, well, we did it this way at my last school, I want to do the same thing here. Instead, what we're looking for is someone with a track record of looking at the challenges, figuring out which are the most important challenges, and then leading a conversation with a senior team and governors to figure out what we're going to do to overcome those challenges, and then really focusing in on a kind of a short list, a small number of activities that they're going to undertake this year, learning from what went wrong, what went right, how it went, and then refining that over time. And that process, which is around strategic thinking, systems thinking, creativity, analytics, as well as really clear leadership skills, that's not necessarily going to be evidenced in a recruitment process by what someone's outcomes were in a previous school. So instead, I'm assuming that you would recommend that during that recruitment process, people are looking at the way people think, the way people have guided a team or an organisation in their previous schools to come to a great result, not just describe the result for us and can you replicate that here, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've certainly seen the use of testing and things like psychometric testing, which is really been used very effectively to unearth some of the key competencies that people have within their DNA and how they challenge and how they integrate with the school community. And some of this is actually goes back to sort of the recruitment processes and how people look at breaking down those barriers and having a really inclusive process, making sure it's accessible. And the amount of times I've had various conversations with different schools over the years, recruiting leaders, where they will have a session where candidates all interact with each other, which may be a lunch or a dinner. And actually, I've been really pushing back and saying that doesn't work, that isn't right, because if you've got candidates that are all competing against each other, one, we don't know who knows who in the sector, you know, that it's so connected that everybody knows everybody in some way. But actually, really, what value does that get? And there's lots of people that have anxiety around eating in groups or around meeting the people they're up against. So how do you then look at doing things in a different way? And how do you involve lots of different stakeholders? So an interview day shouldn't just be a traditional panel interview. There should be an opportunity for people to question, for people to maybe host roundtable sessions, you know, maybe actually talk around a subject and how they would influence that and what they would look like. And it's really interesting when you do a process away from a traditional process and you have other elements away from a panel. So psychometric testing, whether you have sessions where they're discussion sessions or facilitator sessions, you get a really different outcome. And we certainly saw this over the pandemic, actually, because if you look at when people shifted to interviewing online, the people that were hired for the roles were very, very different to those that had, if they'd have gone through a face-to-face process, the outcomes were different because people interact in a different way online and they're more confident and they've got notes and they can come across sometimes more articulate or they're able to just say things that they may not have said in a face-to-face interview. So that was a really interesting development. I'm not sure that online interviewing is the right way to do things as a complete process, but I certainly think you can build that into your process. So you can always have informal online sessions first before you take people into panel stage interviews. That allows you to get to know them a little bit. It breaks down some of those barriers around coming to a school and being faced with a panel of 10 people. At least you've kind of got some interaction with them already. You are able to ask some questions which can help you prepare for those presentations and help you prepare for how you deliver your strategy. And all of this is about making it more accessible. And even if we go right back to the beginning of a recruitment process, some of the adverts that I see out, you know, that they have barriers on them already for people to apply, because job descriptions that are stating things like you must have attended a certain type of university, or you must have a certain work pattern, you know, all of that means that you're narrowing the margin of candidates that can apply for those jobs. So I've done a lot of work around right back from the basic beginning piece of how the advert, how that can actively encourage diverse candidates to apply, how we can capture diversity data throughout that process to know that we're attracting the right type of people. So it starts right from the beginning, and how the adverts go out and how you sell your school. And I think we'll probably touch on this a bit more later, but it's all about creating an employer brand. You know, a school is now a brand, somewhere that people want to work. And through that, you know, you need to have a culture of inclusivity where people feel that there's a sense of uniqueness, that they are joining an organisation for its culture and its values.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is obviously, you know, the letters EDI just sort of slip off the tongue: equality, diversity, inclusion. The reason we group these things together is because they all feed into each other. They're all critically important. And so what you've just described there, especially with looking at adverts and then the journey that a candidate would go on as they're going through that recruitment process, is making people feel genuinely included. And they're not feeling included as in you're the exception, therefore I'm going to go out of my way to make you feel included. It's we're never going to signal that anybody is an exception, and no one's different in this process. Everyone's included right from the very beginning. And I think you're right that we need to have fresh eyes on these things, and especially sometimes with recruitment it can feel there's either a time limit, there's a rush to get the advert out because we know the whole process takes a long time. We need somebody in post. And also it tends to happen when the school is at its busiest, because if we know we've got a handover process, that's just started, we tend to want to just, okay, everything's going on at once, let's just get the advert out. Whereas actually taking the time to prepare all of that process with a fresh pair of eyes to oversee it, can make sure we pick up some of these things as we go through, and getting feedback from candidates as well, I assume part of that process, critically important. The other thing that comes to mind for me in terms of online interviewing, I actually watched in Australia, this was about a decade ago, while pre-pandemic, I interviewed entirely online and then moved over there for the job. And as a candidate, it really wasn't ideal because you don't get a feel for the place online. And yet, if that had been the first stage of interview, that would have been very helpful, not to have to fly to Australia just to see if it was the right fit initially. So I think it's about a hybrid approach, quite a fashionable word at the moment, but hybrid approach to making sure we're utilising the technology, but we're also doing the face-to-face kind of conversations that we need to be having.
Yeah, definitely. And I just think you can actually break down some of those barriers with an initial teams. And, you can also look, quite frankly, in half an hour, you'll know whether somebody's going to be a fit, and it's not wasting people's time. Then you know that the people that if you're going to spend a day, that's a lot of time out of a school day through various people, various stakeholders that are involved. It's also a day off for most candidates that are going through the journey. And I think that's the right thing to do because they need to understand the school community and the various different people. But if you could have had 40 minutes with them online before, often you can know whether they're culturally the right fit for the school, or if they're not aligned, or it's a two-way process. And I think that's what we have to be really mindful of with recruitment, is the market has changed so much, and our working population has changed so much. People have very different agendas now, and one of the things that you have to be wary of the whole way through the process is that a candidate is interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them, and it has to be right for everybody. We've all made those mistakes where we've taken roles where something wasn't quite right, or we had that niggling feeling, and it's very different now. Candidates have multiple offers and they are making informed decisions about where they work, and that comes a little bit back to this piece that I was saying around sort of a brand, and you need to be an employer of choice. So you need to be somewhere that your culture is about challenging assumptions and behaviours that are learned or taught, and you have an environment that is completely open and people feel like they're valued, that they are adding value to the school environment in whatever role they're doing, because actually everybody does have a voice, and it has to be an environment that you have the best possible talent for the right roles, in the right places.
So when we talk about an employer brand, obviously this is a phrase that might slip off your tongue, but it might not be something that everybody's familiar with. I think it's more commonly understood within the corporate sector. What do we mean by that, and what kind of would that phrase employer brand include?
So I think certainly with schools, you're thinking about this more broadly, because actually you want your staff, the people you're hiring, to be integral as part of your community and part of your sell to your parents, to your students. They need to live and breathe your values. They need to understand what it means to work there, what your expectations are, what your standards are, and how they can belong as part of this community, how as an individual coming to work in the school in whatever role they're looking for, that they are able to own that role, and how it fits into the bigger picture and the values of the organisation, and what's the long-term vision, and how is their role in whatever role, and that might be a development role, it might be a bursary role, it might be a deputy head role, a teaching role. Everybody has a unique role to play within that ecosystem of the school. And I think it's been really clear about what that means to each individual and what your standards are as a school, and where you expect to go with your longer term vision, and how that role is really critical to that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of it starts off with things that can feel quite hazy around vision and values, which are important, but they can often feel a little bit vague. And then all the way through to giving examples and stories and kind of testimonials, if like quotations from people who work at the school now, to say, okay, so how does that vision and values actually play out every single day? And giving a feel for what's expected of people, but also the responsibility that the school has to lead the whole school community in a really ethical and kind of values-led way. And one of the things that I've seen increasingly is sections of websites focusing on potential future staff. Is that something that you'd recommend, or is it something that has to sort of flow through the whole website in terms of the importance of people in developing that culture of a school?
Yeah, I would definitely say it has to flow through the whole website. I think you do need a place often on your website where people might be sort of looking at, potentially they may know your school locally, they may not know that whether there's a role, and actually may want to reach out. And I think that's really important, because the way that people engage in recruitment processes changed so dramatically, certainly over the last 5 years. And the vast majority of people don't apply through adverts. You know, we've all probably been very fortunate over the last decade to be able to put an advert out and have one amazing person apply, and that's really changed our process. But how people interact now it's much more around looking at a brand. They'll do their own research, they'll want to see the touch points of people throughout their website. I think the social media channels are really important, and a lot of schools are not necessarily championing those at the moment. There's networks such as LinkedIn, and most schools that I work with don't have any presence on LinkedIn at all, which is mad. You know, we are in 2023 and technology plays a huge part in all of our lives, and it's looking beyond the traditional school's website. And I think that's where there's a big gap at the moment for schools, because they're not looking at any of the social channels. They don't look at advertising. They don't even have pages, a lot of them, on the big networks like LinkedIn. And that is difficult. Certainly if you're looking to attract talent from a global perspective, you know, people look online. They don't go to each individual school or each individual job board. They want it to see. And the technology now is very clever. You know, the algorithms can match in terms of making sure that the right candidates see your information. And there's still probably a journey for most schools to look at what their online branding looks like and how they can start attracting people and getting people to come to them almost, instead of being really reactive and just putting an advert out when they're ready. And I also think there's a way of working with people like myself, you know, and there's various different companies out there. We do a lot of work around talent pooling and looking to the future. So and I'm working with some schools now, you know, a year out, where they're saying to me there's going to be a vacancy, and we're starting to build the work around the branding and what that looks like. We may not necessarily have that role shaped and ready to go to market yet, but what we're doing is we're starting to look at people that are saying to us, look, actually, we're going to be ready for a move in a year's time, 18 months time, or, you know, we're moving from a country, we want to come back to the UK marketplace. What are the type of opportunities available? And that's a really different approach to where we've been for the vast majority of all of our careers in terms of how we recruit. And people are much more smarter now in terms of how they see the proposition. You know, they're looking at already where they think they can go, where does their career go, what does it offer for them. And I still think a lot of the recruitment that we do, certainly in leadership roles in schools, is very reactive, and we need to start moving away from that, which is what we've seen happen in higher education, for example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to dwell briefly on LinkedIn, it's a complete mystery to me as to why schools don't make greater use of LinkedIn from all different perspectives, in terms of marketing for pupils, marketing, obviously staff, what we're talking about here, and fundraising as well. It's a massive opportunity. One of the things that you mentioned at the end are kind of around shaping the role. Obviously, we know that headship is changing, and we're seeing more heads or executive heads, or in some cases actually, you know, using the title CEO, looking at a more strategic commercial business element of running a school. And I'm sure this is actually true within the maintained sector as well. So MATs multi-academy trusts need to make sure that they are thinking commercially as well, not just within the independent school sector or the international school sector. What are the shifts and changes that you're seeing as to how those roles are shaped? Are there trends that are different in different parts of the world or across Europe or the UK?
Yeah, I certainly think the more you explore internationally, the more you see that the role of a head in an international school or executive head is very different to the UK model. And there's probably a reason that lots of people transfer from the UK out, and education is one of our biggest assets because I think we do it very well. I think the independent schools particularly are having to evolve their thinking because they are having to operate more like businesses, and with some of the political backdrop that's facing everybody at the moment, that's just a really topical conversation. And the formation of groups and families of schools is again it's a different way of operating and a different model. And I think for a long time we've probably expected our heads to be a master of everything, and we're now getting to a stage where actually we appreciate that you have to have multiple layers. And you've definitely seen an increase in foundation directors. They seem to be the popular one this year. There's, bursars are now becoming COOs and split roles and having sort of finance directors underneath. You're also seeing under the sort of head role a variety of different roles. So we've seen directors of education, directors of innovation, directors of technology, directors of SEN, safeguarding. So I think there's a real appreciation that you need experts in whatever area is right for your school. And I'm not suggesting you can have hundreds of people, but you need to look at what your school strategy is, and where your head may have a weakness, they appreciate that they need to bring that expertise within the team now. And it's much more around managing people to be experts in their own field, and this idea of having a vision and the head leading that journey is really critical. And I think the skill set will evolve, and it will be interesting to see, and we've already seen this in a couple of the groups, where the chief executive of the group is not an educator. And that for me is a really interesting development, because does that really open up your candidate pool if you put a chief exec type of role in, or that is a non-educational role? And I don't know how that's going to evolve, because we haven't seen it played out enough yet. But that is just an interesting development that you're starting to see with the more commercial businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And regardless of whether or not you go that full kind of movement towards having a non-educationally experienced kind of CEO come in, it's absolutely true. This is a team game. Leadership isn't about one individual at the top. It's a team game. So creating and curating a senior team, a leadership team that complements each other is really important. And as you said, an acknowledgement that the head, executive head, CEO, whatever we're going to call them, the kind of top role in the school or in the group, is never going to be able to do all of it, full stop. And therefore never going to be an expert across all those different areas. And therefore having them, they're conducting the orchestra, they're creating the orchestra and then conducting it. And it's about facilitating conversation, about facilitating change, about driving a school in a kind of a strategic direction forwards. It's a completely different skill set to just coming up through the classroom and then that being enough that you then land a head role. It's been many years since that's been the case, but it's really important now to be thinking about this as a team, putting together a leadership team that really works together.
And I think when you talked about the academies earlier, it's very interesting. So back in the spring, the Department for Education launched the framework for assessing a chief executive of Academy Trust. And it's very, very different to what they've previously had in place. And it's much more around being a strategic leader, looking at that commercial and business acumen. And I think some of those individuals may come from the independent sector, and they may move across, to be honest with you, into the sort of chief exec of MAP roles, because they've already got that skill set. The independent sector's always been more advanced in their thinking around actually our parents and our pupils, our customers, and we've had a duty to protect our reputations and to grow as a business in some ways, and that you may see that moving across into the state sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And another signal again that things are shifting and changing, and that it's an exciting time to be in a leadership role within a school. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hayley, for joining us. I love that our conversation has effortlessly spanned the importance of EDI, looking beyond your competitors for talent, thinking about that employer brand and the importance of having that employer brand, and then coming back up to the kind of higher level conversation of what we need from school leaders in terms of the shifts and changes that we're seeing. Thank you for your time here today. It's been wonderful to have you with us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I love talking to you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye, everybody.